Rachel May, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Latin America and the Caribbean here at USF. And I'm so happy to welcome you all. And Rachel May, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Diaspora. Tonight we'll be discussing some of the issues facing the people of Caribbean descent who are living in the United States. Some of them are immigrants, and some of them are not. I can't think of a more timely topic given our recent election results. The Caribbean diaspora is Black, brown, and white, Hispanic, French, and English speaking, as well as a smattering of Dutch and indigenous language speakers. They are immigrants, both documented and undocumented, and they are also U.S. citizens. They are women, men, gay and straight, young and old. Much of the Caribbean diaspora represents several intersectionalities of these various subcommunities of our neighbors. The issues they face are of utmost importance as we move forward. I also wanted to say a few words before we get started about immigration as a human rights issue. All countries have immigrants except for maybe North Korea, and immigrants have special rights because of their vulnerable status. Non-citizens do not anywhere have exactly the same rights as citizens, but they nevertheless do not forfeit their human rights or the protection of the international community just because they have moved. They are entitled to recognition before the law, regardless of whether or not they have proper documentation. They're entitled to basic education and fair labor standards. But we'll talk tonight about some of these things. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers and welcome you on behalf of ISLAC and the University of South Florida. Our first speaker tonight is Joyce Hamilton-Henry. She has an MSW from the University of Connecticut School of Social Work and a PhD in social policy from Brandeis University. She was an adjunct faculty member at the University of Hartford in African American Studies, Sociology, and Psychology. And she has presented extensively on Caribbean immigrants. She's published papers on original research about the experience of Caribbean immigrants in the diaspora, and she's the author of No One Asked About Us, the Underrepresentation of African Americans and Latinos on Local Boards and Commissions. She is currently employed by the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, of Florida. The ACLU protects and defends the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Our second speaker, Christiana Best, has a BS in Sociology from St. John's University, an MSW from Hunter College, and a PhD in Social Welfare from Silberman, which is what used to be Hunter College, I just learned. She migrated from Grenada to the United States, to New York City at the age of 15, at which time she was reunified with her mother after 5 years of separation. She has worked in the New York City child welfare system for 28 years. Her body of work is focused on transnational parenting and the migratory journeys of parents and children alike. Additionally, Christiana has been working to raise awareness and educate the child welfare workforce in New York City about the issue of racial disproportionality and disparity as it relates to African American children and families in the United States. Christiana is also a mother, one of her most accomplished roles. Linda Travernier-Almada is a faculty member in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies and Africana Studies. She has a BA, an MA, and a PhD, all from the University of California at Berkeley. She's a president of Florida's oldest Haitian organization, 30 years old, the Haitian Association Foundation of Tampa Bay. She has taught anthropology for several years, and now she's teaching Africana Studies. Her focus is on folklore symbols in Black opposition movements. So I will turn it over now to Joyce, and welcome everyone.
That's why I like old-fashioned. Back up.
Hello. Hello.
I know, I'll have someone come and fix it, it'll be here in 2 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you to talk about a topic that is certainly very near and dear to my heart. And as you can tell, I'm from the Caribbean. I'm from Jamaica originally. And my focus is really on looking at the push and pull factors for migration to the United States by individuals from the Caribbean region. And at some point, I may end up inserting some of my own personal stories to kind of exemplify the Caribbean experience. As was already indicated by Dr. May, individuals from the Caribbean are linguistically, culturally, ethnically, and racially diverse. As a matter of fact, many of the islands in the Caribbean are considered very pluralistic societies because we've been dealing with the diversity in what we believe is constructive ways. For example, some of the English-speaking islands include Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Antigua, and Barbuda as examples, by no means a complete list. Spanish-speaking include Cuba and the Dominican Republic. French include Haiti, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint Martin. And Dutch-speaking include Saint Martin, M-A-A-R-T, and two different spellings, one French, one side French, one side Dutch. What I had in the PowerPoint was a map of the Caribbean so that you could see it, and hopefully we brought up so that you can. The U.S. population, there are about over 300 individuals living in the United States, and 42 million of those individuals are immigrants. 4 million of the immigrant population from the Caribbean. And as you well know, and I've heard on numerous occasions, and especially over the past couple of months during the presidential campaign, we have 11+ million individuals who are undocumented in the United States, a problem that we need to resolve. But what it really does is emphasizes the fact that immigrants live in mixed status households. By that I mean that the individuals who are U.S.-born, native-born to the United States. You have individuals who are legal permanent residents who came here and are living here legally as legal permanent residents. And you may have some individuals and families who are undocumented. And so when you have policy changes and outcomes or threats to immigrants, it is not just limited to the so-called undocumented group. It really spans the whole family and communities. Now, I mentioned that individuals from there are 40 million individuals and 4 million from the Caribbean. 5 countries predominate. 90% of the Caribbean immigrants are from Cuba, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago. Now, push factors. In general, the push factors are usually the reasons why people choose to leave their country of origin to migrate elsewhere. And more specifically, in a broader sense, natural disasters, which is really also specific to the Caribbean. We are very, very much aware of Haiti, the earthquake, as an example. Montserrat, with the volcano eruption. Natural disasters are reasons why people leave their country of origin. Political unrest. We hear about that. We know about, for example, the political regime in terms of Cuba's history as one example. What's going on in some island nations where the change in government make people feel that they have to leave their country of origin. And I'm sure you'll be hearing more about even Haiti's whole political changing in government and what it does to folks choosing to stay or leave. Economic reasons are also a reason why people leave. High unemployment, poverty, and out of that, limited opportunities for professional advancement. And so for some individuals, it's also religious oppression are reasons why they leave their country of origin. Not necessarily so that much in the Caribbean, but in a broader sense in terms of why people migrate or become refugees. And civil wars, part of the political unrest is also civil wars that push people out of their country, their home country, to other parts of the world. Now, the reality is that for many people, when they leave their country of origin, the hope is that they will return. They're hoping that the conditions that cause them to leave will change, will improve, and they will eventually return. But the pull factors, Emma Lazarus, the poem on the Statue of Liberty, really emboldened a lot of people to come to the United States, but certainly made the U.S. a welcoming place, historically welcoming place for immigrants. But, in search of the American dream, the golden door, those opportunities. But basic human rights are reasons why people come to the United States. The opportunity for freedom of speech, freedom of worship, as an example. Reasons why they come for safety. Educational opportunities. That's the reason why my mother wanted to be in the U.S. Employment opportunities for herself, and educational opportunities. And employment opportunities, jobs. They want to be able to take care of their families, and they want a better quality. We want a better quality of life, and we will pick up and be the first in our families many times to migrate, abroad for those seeking those opportunities. Overall, better quality of life. Now, historically, Caribbean immigrants, the Caribbean islands, as you know, as you also because of the cultural differences, is reflective of the countries that originally building their empire that colonized these islands. So, England for the English-speaking islands, Spain originally, including some English-speaking islands, eventually gained their independence, was further colonized by England, for example, and eventually gained their independence. So it's a reflection, the linguistic aspects of reflection of the countries that originally, colonized them. So many individuals, in particular from the English-speaking islands, would migrate to England because at that time, that's where the opportunities were, and being a Commonwealth, they were able to go there and seek out a better life for themselves. The U.S. opportunities to migrate to the U.S. opened up and started to shift in 1964, in the 60s, really, 50s, 60s, and more people started migrating to the U.S. and also to Canada. There's a large Caribbean population in Canada as well. So the push factors, as I stated, the pull factors are just better opportunities, better quality of life, safety, security, etc. Now, there's a concept called transnational migration, and other speakers will be talking more about that in depth, so I won't go into too much detail. But transnational migration speaks to the fact that migrating populations, they have multiple networks, not only multiple networks within their country of origin, and they also develop networks within their host country, their adopted country, as in the context of the United States. And their life involves moving back and forth between the two countries. And because they do have, to a great extent, they still have family members in their home country. And they have the responsibility to take care of those family members at home, as well as responsibilities for family members here as well. So in essence, they're living between two worlds, living in two societies, and having to negotiate and navigate both and moving back and forth depending on their obligations and their responsibilities in the country. The pattern of migration is a classic pattern of migration for Caribbean immigrants, and it very much is dependent on the policy, and in this case, of the U.S. immigration policy, and how easy or difficult it is for that individual to get to this country. So, we're often used to the fact we talk about refugees and asylees. We're used to the fact in terms of refugees and asylees, they come as an intact family. Parents and children, they all arrive in the U.S. together. But for individuals from the Caribbean, again, depending on the reason to leave, and depending on the first in their family to come to the U.S., or they're sponsored by a family member to come to the U.S., one parent comes first. That parent arrives, and the first thing they do is, if the sponsored person is a family member, they stay with that family member. The first thing they do, if they're of working age, they will seek out a job. Oftentimes they'll take any job available because they want to start making some money. They need to start establishing themselves in a way that they could eventually establish their own household and eventually be able to bring the rest of their family, i.e. their children, their young children, and or a spouse with them to be united in the United States. So what often happens is that the parent will leave the child in the care of a family member. It could be their sister, their uncle, their own parent for a period of time. That period of time could be 2 years, it could be 5 years, it could be 7 years before they're reunited with their children, who at the time of reunification are in the may have left a young child who's a pre-adolescent or now adolescent, and that creates certain challenges which I will go into because behavior driven by other speakers. To the extent that the parent is able to, and especially based on their own immigrant status, they will travel back and forth and it's a transnational migration. They'll go home, visit their children, visit their family, and return. Go on vacation and return to the US. Eventually, as I mentioned, it could be years, often it's years, that children will not be unemployed in the United States. And so I mentioned before that many individuals will leave with the intention of returning. Few end up returning. And so what also happens during the period of separation is that the parent would send money home, to take to the family members taking care of your child or children. They will send barrels that would include clothing, food, and also materials that the family could use in abundance so that the family members are taken care of. Depending on the financial status and situation of the family members, if they have excess items, sometimes they may sell it. They may even sell material, things that they could use themselves, sell to generate extra income. And of course, they send money to care of the children. Now, many of these island nations depend heavily on remittance. And remittance is the money that they're sending home on a regular basis to pay for the child's school books, to pay for their education, to pay for other things that the family and the household needs. And for many of these islands, we're highly dependent on remittance. Remittance is like second highest for tourism, is what keeps the economy going. And I want to put a little asterisk to that because one of the fear on the incoming president and the statements he made about immigrants in general, or more specifically, is a fear that there will be a curtailment of the amount of money going out, leaving the US, going out of the country to their home country, which will have devastating impact on the families at home because they rely heavily on that money. And depending on the country and the country's economy, the money they send, no matter how small, goes a long way there. And so, for example, and I called up a friend of mine on the route here this evening to make sure I have the correct information to give to you in terms of what the exchange does and sort of multiplying the amount of money an individual has to spend and take care of back home. Jamaica, for example, $1 American, the exchange rate in Jamaica, $1 American is 125 Jamaican dollars. I repeat, $1 American is 125 Jamaican dollars. That means a lot. That with exchange is a lot of money that a family member is able to have. And income is not going up to reflect inflation. And so things can be inflated and very expensive here, but still, you said $100, that's a lot of money. You said $1,000, that's a lot of money to that family to be able to take care of themselves and for them to be able to take care of their children. So I just wanted to share that little information with you. Reunification, parents and children are reunified years later. And so some of the challenges that the children face coming up is that coming to the United States and being reunited with their parents, beyond the usual culture shock, depending on where they migrate to, not Florida, but New England, for example, where it's cold, is the weather. The diet is not much of a culture shock now as it was before because we have Pizza Hut and McDonald's and Kentucky and everything you can imagine here, there, so that's not much of an issue. The parent-child relationship. The parent leaves a young child, being either a teenager or a pre-adolescent. There are issues now in parenting. The parent was like a Santa Claus figure. They want something, you send it to them because it's also guilt. And so, you know, what happens is that the parent who's now was a Santa Claus figure becomes a disciplinarian. Setting rules in terms of who they could socialize with, what they do after extracurricular activities, etc. That becomes an issue. The educational issues and needs of the child as they adjust into a different school system can be challenging. The parents working 1.5 to 2 jobs is an issue for parents who need to be spending, as all parents wanted to spend quality time with their children. That presents challenges. It often also results sometimes in children being put in a parentified child role of being having responsibility for young siblings, and some of these siblings they may or may not have met. With time, I would like to, at the end, I could answer some questions about this, but I do want to just mention a couple of things and cite myself as an example to kind of exemplify some of what I'm going to say. First generation, my mother was one of those individuals who came to the US, and at the time when she came as a domestic. That was the quickest, fastest way for her to get here. She was sponsored by a white Jewish family in New Hampshire to work for them, taking care of their children and doing housework. And she left me in the care of my aunt. And then 2 years later, she came in 67. 2 years later, I joined her in 69. That was a quick period of time. I won't go into all the details, but my mom, who is now deceased, she died 2 years ago. She came for the reasons that I mentioned, the pull factors. She was alive long enough to see me get my doctorate and exceeding even her own expectations. She bought a house, made her salary, worked 1.5 to 2 jobs. And talking with my colleague and friend earlier, we really feel that now that in retrospect, working with long hours really contributed to her deteriorated health over time because she pushed herself intensely. I came as a child. I often say to people, the older I get, the younger I was when I came, so you remember my age. But I came as a child, and I was a 1.5 generation. 1.5 generation for kids of those who came as children. Then you have the second and now fast-growing third generation of Caribbeans in the US, and the second generation of those who were born here, either of one or both Caribbean parents. And because, again, immigrants live in mixed status households, it's very possible that one parent may be Caribbean and the other person is Native American. Because yes, there's that interaction and marriages and relationships across racial ethnic groups. Many individuals, as I mentioned, expect to return home. But there's a saying now that really resonates well within immigrant communities and also in the Caribbean community. Home is where the grandchildren are. So for many of these individuals who expected to return 10, 20 years later, once their children are grown, went to college, get their education, and is now established and launched, they're remaining in the US. Some do return, but fewer and fewer are returning, especially if the conditions, economic conditions, or political conditions doesn't change that much, but particularly because the children, grandchildren are here. And to the extent that they do return home, they return during the summertime, so that they could visit their family, particularly if they're living up where it's cold, they return in the summertime and so on. Other speakers will be talking about dimensions of this, and so once again, I will not go into all the details, but I certainly am available to answer any questions you may have afterwards regarding that. The other speakers, as you heard from their individual and collective background, will be talking about adjustment issues that children and families face, and also some of the unique issues that are, some issues that are generalized across the Caribbean for Caribbean immigrants, but also some issues that are unique to certain individuals from certain islands within the Caribbean. And so, without any further ado, I will now turn it over to my friends and colleagues and let them elaborate further on some of the points that I highlighted. But again, I'm available to answer the questions that you have.
Good evening. So my name is Christiana Best, and I'm here to speak to you particularly about a phenomenon that is common in many immigrant communities called transnational parenting. So how many of you are familiar with that term or understand what it means? Can you just share what you know?
Yeah, so I think it stands out most to me with transnational parenting is bringing values and principles and philosophies about how to parent from one country together and how that's sustainable.
All right. Anyone else? Did I see another hand? Transnational parenting? So, so that is a conceptual one way of looking at it. For the most part, these are parents who are living in this country and their children continue to live back home in their country of origin. And so they do continue to hold those values dear to them. So when the children do reunite with them, that does happen. Of course, the children then intersect with the American culture, and that sometimes has some challenges in and of itself. But transnational parenting is a phenomenon that happens with many immigrants, particularly when there are restrictive immigration laws. And by that I mean, these are, as you mentioned before, for refugees and asylees, you actually come as an intact family. But because of restrictive immigration laws between developed country and developing countries, and you can find that in parts of Europe, where, say, families from Poland might migrate to richer countries in Europe, or even families from the Philippines migrate to California and the West Coast here, and certainly families from Mexico in the Southwest primarily. So you would find transnational parenting happening globally now because developed countries are recruiting women primarily to do childcare, elderly care, a lot of the reproductive work, as opposed to reproductive work, right? Normally, the traditional immigrant, when parents are coming individually or coming before their children, is usually male, right? The traditional immigrant is male. Husband, father, gets settled, or parents come together with their children and get settled. But due to underemployment and unemployment in many developing countries, and due to reproductive work, which is primarily open to women, we find that in developing countries, you see a great deal of women migrating and leaving their children behind. And as you know, in all communities, women and mothers are supposed to be nurturers. So they're not supposed to leave their children, right? So it's contradictory and counterintuitive in many ways for mothers to leave their children for many years to go work, be the primary caretaker of the family. And it also reverses the role in the household. So we know in most traditional families that the father is the breadwinner. So when the woman comes here to work, she becomes the breadwinner. It's irrespective of whether the husband or father is working in his country. Chances are, as you just learned, because of the exchange, the mother is making more. So there's reverse roles, and there's also separation and loss that happens as a result of the mother becoming the primary immigrant. So that's a phenomenon that's been going on for a while. It started sometime around 1965 with the Hart-Keller law. And it's important for us to kind of understand that. I did some research around Afro-Caribbeans in particular, from the English-speaking countries. So So I want to talk, some of what I'm going to talk about has to do with, I'm not sure if I know which one it has. Okay, so what's important to understand about the English-speaking Caribbean is that when immigrants come here in this country, they become invisible because primarily they're lumped with other groups. Racially, they are the same as African Americans, but of course, the cultural difference can be alarming in addition to the fact that they have to worry about immigration status, right? Another significant factor that has a lot of implications. So racially and language, they speak English, so they really don't stand out as much as the non-English speaking immigrants. There has been a lot of resources sort of geared towards non-English speaking immigrants, rightly so, because language is a significant factor, right? But if you're not, if you're speaking English and with an accent, not so much resources. And certainly the region, when we talk about immigrants from the Caribbean, particularly African immigrants, they're sort of swallowed out because they're not really counted as much. They're smaller in numbers, and many of the countries are smaller for the most part, with the exception of Jamaica. And so they're really invisible. They're invisible coming as immigrants, and they're invisible when they get here. But they share a lot of the same cultural patterns as other countries in the Caribbean, and they share the language and race with African Americans here. So there are some similarities. So it's just really an interesting group of people. Having an understanding of this group would help in many areas, particularly in some of the systems like education, child welfare, immigration reform, healthcare, mental health, law enforcement, and criminal justice system. And I also want to later emphasize some of the mental health issues that come with immigration as a whole. So one of the things that also happens when immigrants come here is we get the message somehow, and I don't know how this is given. It's not explicitly stated. There are no pamphlets that tell us this. But we clearly get the message that African Americans are at the bottom of the totem pole, and no one wants to be there. And so immigrants come here, regardless of what part of the world they're coming from, including the Caribbean, and they see African Americans as in a negative way. And so nobody wants to be included with African Americans. Sadly to say though, when we look at legislations that African Americans have worked hard for and have had passed, every immigrant that comes into this country has benefited from it, including people from Asia and other parts of the world. Because due to the civil rights movement, and we all know the enormous amount of sacrifices that both white and black people have had to endure in order to get the civil rights movement to pass. As a result of that, we also got the immigration law of 1965, and that was a tremendously significant law because it opened the doors for people of color. It opened the doors for Asian people to come in, it opened the doors for South Americans, from Africans, from the continent, from the Caribbean, it opened the door. So when African Americans, I always try to tell people that I teach teachers, right, at this point, but I sometimes teach social workers, and I often say, why are you coming here and looking at African Americans in a negative way? You're benefiting from everything they've done. So if nothing else that you take with you, please remember that and pass the word on. It's almost an apology. It's crazy. But anyway, I could go on. So I really want to make that point and bring it home. As was mentioned before, I work in the child welfare system. I see it. The racism is prevalent there as well. And so it's very passion and mission for me. Transnational parenting. So most of my work is documented in this book. Just needed to say that, and I'm not going to proud of myself. So that occurs when there are restricted laws. So many of the immigrants are given visas to come here for their children. They're given visas to come here to work. They come in legally, not undocumented. However, because it's temporary, many of them want to continue to work on the state of visas, and that's what happens. And so transnational families, the Caribbean has been a population, particularly the English-speaking Caribbean, that has traveled and experienced transnationalism for generations. Most of it occurred in the region. It's not unusual for people from there to travel to Cuba or to Jamaica or Barbados, depending on where the economy is thriving and whether or not it's a real country in terms of push-pull factors. It had a natural disaster or was undergoing some kind of economic depression. People moved, they traveled, and they went to different places. So if you went to Venezuela, you would find that there's an English-speaking community there with lots of women who went there to work as domestics. If you went to Aruba, you would find that there's a large English-speaking Caribbean community there, because at some point, many of the women went to work in the industry, right? In the Dominican Republic, you would find that there's an English-speaking community there, because during the days when, I think it was cocoa, there was sugarcane, for instance, in Cuba. Panama, there was a large English-speaking community, because when they were building the Panama Canal, people were traveling there to work and to earn money for their families. So the movement and the traveling within the Caribbean region is significant and has been for generations. And after a while, people started moving out of the Caribbean area. Initially, the movement was around primarily education. So people, countries like Canada, the United States, and Europe, to become doctors and lawyers, because that was impossible there. So their families would select one of them, usually a boy or male, and send them overseas to become a doctor or lawyer, and come back to help the families. So this type of transnational families that you're seeing today is quite different than what occurred many years ago. And yeah, it's just different. Serial migration or chain migration, a very significant part of it, because as I said, the woman is coming, they're the main immigrant, and then they're sending for family members, generally children first, or in some cases, when I did my research, one mother had 5 children. She sent for the oldest girl, and she could help her work and take care of the others. And so, again, when it was time for her son to come, who was the next in line, because of the racial tension and fear of her son becoming very shot, she chose not to bring him. He himself then became very resentful because he wanted to be reunified with his mother, not understanding her fear for him coming to this country. Child fostering is a really significant part of this process of transnational parenting, simply because it is part of our culture as African people. It's something that was carried over from the African continent. And so it's an informal transfer of parenting. I see someone nodding their head, whereby, if you have an elderly aunt and you have 2 or 3 children, it's not unusual to send one of them to live with that aunt and to help take care of the aunt, and in turn, the aunt takes care of you. So you didn't have to worry about sending them to a nursing home necessarily, right? Because family members were taking care of that. And so that's kind of how you do that. Or if you have several children and you weren't able to financially take care of that, it's not unusual for another family member to take 1 or 2 of those children and raise them just like that, right? So child fostering originated in that way. And so how it works with transnational families and transnational parenting is that when the parent leaves, they leave that child with a relative, usually a grandmother, an aunt, cousin. And when families are variable because of illness or they're just not around, then they would use guardians. There are people in the community now who, that's their role, they take care of children. So it sort of resembles child welfare in some ways, but in an informal way. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the West Indian family, just to go a little more in depth. So the extended family is very significant for the West Indian family. It just is. It's always been, and it's a part of it. So, and that would also include godparents and sometimes non-related family members. Usually in the community, everybody's family. And so, but what some of the research has shown, particularly in Jamaica, is that there is also, and may also be, class issues related to family structure as well. And so you would find single-headed female household, at least in one of the studies, in the lower class, as opposed to the middle class families. Now, I don't know how prevalent that is, but that certainly was an interesting study I found. Parenting style. Okay, so that's probably where I'm going to talk about a little bit about mental health, right? So parenting style is very rigid and punitive and top down, okay? And so for the most part, children are supposed to obey their parents, respect their parents, and just do everything that they say because they know best, and it just is. So there's very little room, and I think things are changing because of globalization. Things are changing somewhat. So, but what I will say is that this still continues, for the most part, to be the most prevalent way of parenting. So children are punished. Usually they're beaten, and it's not unusual. Certainly, when I was growing up in the Caribbean, I was beaten in school if I did something wrong. So it's not unusual to be sent to the principal's office and to be punished physically for doing something. I mean, I could be talking back to a teacher saying something. So how does that then intersect with what happens with the child in the child class here? And the child sees other family members having conversations and being able to say to your parent, I'm not happy with this decision you just made, in a respectful way. But that's not really something that is allowed to Not really. By the second generation, we try to move towards that, right? And we try to be a little more flexible. But God forbid you were to be in a family gathering and one of the grandkids were to say something to the parent that sounded disrespectful, chances are they would get slapped. So, you know, it's really important to understand that many of them might end up in the child welfare system for punishment because one is legal, you know, there are laws around what is allowed and what is not, but most times when parents strike a child, they're so angry that, you know, they're usually out of control. So oftentimes what happens is that someone sees the bruise and the child ends up in the child welfare system that is not very known to this community. Education is critical. It is like really, really, really important. Many of the women that I interviewed for my study would tell me the reason for coming was because they wanted to get an education and they also wanted their children to get an education. Because education is seen as the most primary form of upward mobility in the Caribbean, right? And as a result, it is very critical. The educational system there varies depending on the country and the economical situation, and also varies urban or rural. And so because we cover all many times, roads may get destroyed, buildings such as school buildings may get destroyed, and so sometimes the educational system may not be as consistent in times of those situations. I will say though that where it is very good for the most part. It's everything that you should, as I said, I teach teachers and in the special education program, and so we don't see that much in the program. We don't identify children with disabilities or learning disabilities and get them the help, because really even the smartest teachers, and unfortunately, when those children come here, by the time it's identified, it might be a little late. So we have to look for some of those things as well. Learning style, really important. For the most part in this country, learning, teaching is, the expectation is that students would be active participants in their learning. Not so much back home, you're more recipient of information, and therefore you might have a child who comes to class and sits quietly and just takes the information in, not really understanding that that's their learning style, that that's what they're used to. And you might even think that they have a learning disability. So oftentimes you find that many of these children are sent to special education classes when in fact they don't need it. They just learn it. And my son, for instance, while he was born in this country, he lived in a household where both his parents are from the Caribbean. He's nothing like me, because I think I adapted quite well. And quite good. His personality is very much like his dad, and so he could be in a classroom and just sit there quietly, and you would have no idea unless you ask the question, what's going on. And so I remember him being selected to go to be tested for special ed. And I'm thinking, really? Okay, what are some of the reasons why? Anyway, I went into school that day, stopped the process. They left a voicemail message telling me they were going to evaluate him. So I walked in and said, not really. You're not going to do that. And then I spoke to the social worker, being a social worker, and I said, you know, I really would like you to go to the class and pay attention to my son and to see what it is that may be concerning to the teacher that she would recommend him to get evaluated. And so she did. Not every parent has that resource available to them, so let me say that. So she did. I'm sorry, you have to hand up?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wondered, this teaching style, is this like from the government, or is it something that the schools would be open to changing that? It's, letting the students become more involved. What is the basis for wanting to be so strict in that style? It's really not working out.
So what I would say is that we were like that as a country previously. We have evolved as a country, and we've learned more about how people learn and how teaching can be different. So we are further ahead than most countries. And the hope is that that will also happen there. It's just that I can only talk about the English-speaking countries, and most of what we did came from probably aged a bit, not as evolved as they have. But what I would say is that with globalization, I think that also may change. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little further. Okay. All right, so where was I? Oh, thank you. Back to my son. So so then she went to observe my son, and she not only observed his behavior, his interaction, she took him out of the classroom, and apparently the teacher read a story, and then the teacher would ask questions. and the kids in the class would put their hand up and say, maybe can I ask a question? And he sat there, and he didn't do any of that. And so she took him out of the classroom and asked him questions about the story, and he was able to answer each one of them. So he was the kind of child who continues to today. If you ask him a question, he will respond. If you don't, he doesn't have anything to tell you because you didn't ask him. And that's very typical of how his father is. And as a matter of fact, when he was in college, I mean, a couple of times I wrote the supper with him, and I'm sitting there, and I'm like, did you see that? And he's like, Mom, do not eyeball people. That's because it's like, I'm under the radar. That's just his personality. And so I say that to say, he was born in this country. He has a mother, I think, who's assertive, yet as a child, his personality isn't anything like mine, and his learning style isn't anything like mine. I had to adapt to it, and I had to help his teachers understand that as well. So if he didn't have me as his mother, he could have ended up in special ed. So religion is extremely important. That moment is over. Wow. Okay, so religion is extremely important. Christianity is the most predominant. Again, Catholic, Protestant. But then, of course, in Jamaica, and that has also spread outside of Jamaica, Rastafari. And of course, what is also sort of subtle are some of the African religions that are practiced in almost every country. It's called different things in different places. Yes? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so as a social worker, given what I've said, there are some things I'm very concerned about. So I'm concerned about, I mean, there is no question that children from the West Indies, whether they've been counted to transnational parenting, which is long distance parenting, being cared for both by a caretaker who's a relative at home in their country of origin, and also being co-parented by a parent living in a foreign country. In this case, it happens to be New York City. And New York City, of course, is so what I'm most concerned about is the psychological impact, certainly, of the transnational parenting, right? Many of these children are feeling a sense of abandonment simply because even though cognitively they understand the parents had to migrate for financial reasons or whatever the reason is, they're still feeling abandoned. And while every child, most children feel loved because they know their parents love them, they know their parents sacrificed to give them what it is that they currently have, I can't say that we are a very feely, touchy kind of community, particularly in the English-speaking, right? And so when they come here and they see that display of affection, and I'm not saying that it happens in every family, and I'm not saying every family is necessarily, but we're not a very touchy-feely kind of community. And so when they see that happens, when they come to this country, you know, it has an impact. What is also very significant is the idea that we don't wallow in our suffering. You know, we don't spend a lot of time crying for. We don't spend a lot of time, you know, feeling sorry for ourselves. And so if a child is upset and is crying, it's not unusual to hear the parents say, "Do you want me to give you something to cry about?"
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, we do that. Yeah, we do that.
So the emotional nurturing is not explicitly displayed. Although if you ask the child if his or her parent loved them, they would say, yes, I know that my parents love me because they sacrifice and they take care of me. But that part is missing, and as a result, as a social worker, I'm always very concerned about that, particularly when it's compounded by the transnational parenting phenomenon, right? trauma is a significant part, and I don't want to lose that. As a social worker, we're always looking at that. It's part of the immigrant experience in general, irrespective of the immigrant. Even when you choose to come here and you're not leaving for a reason, but trauma occurs as a part of it, and the acculturation process can also be traumatic. Particularly if you come here to get a job and you're not employed, you can't help your family. You know, that brings on depression and different types of issues related to trauma. What is important about children who are part of the transnational parenting experience is that the separation and loss happens for them twice, right? So when the parent leaves, that is the separation that they experience. But then they bond with their caretaker, particularly if that person is caring and loving. And then when they're reunited here in this country, it happens again. They have to leave their caretaker and come through. And so this is very traumatic, and they're suffering again a second time in terms of the separation and loss. And so it's not unusual sometimes for them to come here and not eat as a way of expressing that, or overeat. And you see all kinds of symptoms of depression as a result. What I will say though is that given the sacrifice that the parents have to make, and I say that because it's not easy to come here and get documented. To be documented, it takes time, it takes a lot of money. And so parents work 2 and 3 jobs in order to do that, so they can send to their children and their children can experience what it's like to live in a community where they don't have to worry about that. I will say that not all the mothers did that, because after 5 years when they couldn't bring their children here and they spent all this money and lawyers took their money and it didn't result in them getting this status change, some of the mothers in the study actually just brought their kids up. They were just, that's it. You're gonna have to come here, you're gonna be undocumented, we're gonna work it out, I can't do this anymore. Or their children might say, listen, or someone will say to them, your child is so depressed and so unhappy, I'm afraid they may hurt themselves. Or the child might threaten to hurt themselves, so they just bring it up. Planned reunification is usually the best way, and by that I mean that the mother has gotten her immigration status changed from undocumented to documented, and the child is given an opportunity to say goodbye to loved ones and finish the school year, and then come. But if there's a disruption because someone is caretaking the dog, or because the child threatened to hurt themselves, or anything like that, and they have to bring that child up, or that they have to bring the child without having their status documented, it creates a great deal of challenge and stress on the parent. Another thing that could bring on stress for them is that when they come, they find that their mother may have another child in this country, or may have another husband. You know, this relationship ended during the separation between her husband and her child or whatever. So there could be a lot of issues. So I find while I was part of this, and it brings me a great deal of passion in this type of work, it's also very challenging. It's very challenging. Survival is pretty much what happens with these families for a long time before they can start right again. What I will say though is that the immigration experience does not stop when the child arrives. It's carried on. So my son, while he was born in this country, has been part of the immigrant experience. And so my parenting style may have been influenced by my personal. And by that I can say that I'm overprotective. He's 28 years old and I'm calling him up, did you eat? You know? Just examples of that very, very protective. Like anyone were to try to say they were going to take my son away from me when he was growing up, it would have been a problem. So thank you.
So here's the problem I'm having. A lot of what I was planning to say has already been said. So, what I will tell you will be a bit choppy because I kind of picked up on some of the things, scratched some things off, added some things from what I heard. So it's going to be an interesting presentation. As you can see from up there, I'm Linda Travernier-Almada, and I don't need to reintroduce everything because you did such a great introduction to me. I am part Haitian and part Cuban. I'm also part German. I am part Native American. And a lot of people from the Caribbean are like me. We're what we call mutts because we were colonized by so many different people. We end up having all sorts of blood in us. When most Americans look at us, they see us as African American. But when we look at ourselves, we see a whole lot of other things. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, about how we see ourselves versus how we are seen, how we are perceived. So let's see what's scribbled here. As you can see from there, I will be focused a little bit more on Haiti than the broad picture. Let's talk a little bit about the broad picture first, about islanders, primarily islanders. I focus my talk on islanders in the United States. And unlike a lot of people who discuss people from the Caribbean, I call islanders. I take a very different route, and I often get in trouble for it. I take the route that we are different. We are different from the African American. We are different from the Hispanic. We are different from the Anglo-American or from the Italian American. Islanders are different. There's no doubt about that. You ask the question about the educational system. Why not change it if it's so strict and it doesn't work? Here's the gist of it. It does work. It's not pleasant. It's not a happy thing. When a kid goes to school, the thing they're gonna know is you better sit in that chair and behave. And the results show that it does work. Primarily, for example, in the Caribbean, the educational system turns out better educated Black youths than the whole American system, even those in elite wealthy areas. That's statistics. They turn out the young Black individuals in the Caribbean and in Africa, and I'll add Africa because I teach African studies, turn out better educated than they do here in the United States. One of the things, and like I said, it's going to be a bit choppy. I'm just going to kind of pick up on some of these issues. A few years back, the state of Florida published a policy where it stated that by 2017, this is it had a list of where they would have the different groups in Florida in terms of educational level. They were going to implement this program where they were going to have all sorts of wonderful things to help the students, high school students move forward. And this is what they decided would happen. This was, I believe, 2012. Don't quote me on that, but around that time. So this was way back when they decided that in 2017, the white students would have benefited and would have achieved a 97% status in terms of improvement. That the Asian student would be at a 98% status in terms of improvement and going back. We're talking math, English, and so on and so forth. That the African African American students in Florida would achieve, I believe it was a 60-something status, and that the reason I didn't bother to remember the number is because I can tell you what other group was in the same category. The other group that was in the same category as African American children were students with mental disabilities and students who are still part of the ESL program, so they do not speak English very well. So with all of the programming in the United States and all of the warmth and loving and what you think is, you know, not the right system, ours, which is strict and annoying and a pain in the neck, our kids, they reach the 97. The teachers expect the 97% in the Black communities. And that's throughout the Caribbean. Okay, so that kind of went there. No way. But you guys get the gist. Okay, what was the next thing in terms of the Caribbean or the islander who comes here within the educational system? The islander who is born in the United States and raised in the United States learns, achieves a lesser per GPA level, a lower GPA level, actually migrates here. And again, these are the numbers. You have in the United States the highest achieving groups right now in the United States. And this isn't just the islanders of the Caribbean. These are also, this data is also for Africans who, not African Americans, but Africans who come here as opposed to Africans who are born here. Statistically, those who migrate here at a later age and who are not born here achieve more here in the United States when they come, as opposed to their counterpart who were born here. Why is that? Well, there's a different right now, for example, in terms of the highest achieving group in the United States is the African population, not the African population who's born here, the African population who migrated here. So it's important to think about is a non-strict system necessarily a good thing? So let's see. So why am I always kind of the eyeball down in terms of presenting about the Caribbean? Primarily because I do see a difference. When the way Caribbean children are raised is different. The culture is fundamentally different. Whether the Caribbean child is here, and when I talk about the Caribbean child and Northern Island child, I'm talking about one who's maybe first and second generation. Beyond that, we kind of lose them, you know. But if the parents were islanders, if the parents were islanders, then what you have are children who are raised as if they were still in the islands. And so there's a whole dynamic that you see in these children that you don't see in other groups. For example, I do a lot of work with the court system, right? Where I deal with juveniles in the court system. And when you bring in a Caribbean child as opposed to any other group in terms of the African American and the white American, not just the African American, but the white American, the behaviors are fundamentally different. When the parents come in to the courtroom with their child, the child has no voice. Is that a good thing? Maybe not. You know, is that child going to behave? I mean, oh yeah. Whatever trouble that child got into, he's going to regret it for the rest of his life. He's going to get penance for the rest of his life. The court's not gonna have to do anything to it. Because by the time he gets to the court, the whole community has already here, and I'm talking about here in the US, the whole community has already, done everything possible for him to make him feel like he is so bad. Okay, and that, but there's hope. I don't just believe in hope. There's always hope. So when I sit in the courtroom and I see either the African American child or the white American child who is brought in because they did something wrong, 90% of the time, the island child is, by the time they've gotten to the courtroom, so remorseful, so ready to just die and crawl in the hole. Is that a good thing? Yeah, maybe if I'm open-minded and I'm my heart is breaking for them. Yes. Is my heart breaking for them? Yes. But do I know that there's a better chance that that child is not going to do that again or get into more trouble? Yes, I do. There's something else in terms of the island child that I noticed working with the courts. I'm sorry, I completely left the PowerPoint because, like I said, my stuff just got flowed out over by these beautiful ladies. There's something called repatriation. Repatriation, which is done by the government of the United States when they send their children back, or children back, let's say, to Haiti. But there's another aspect of repatriation. The island child here, and I know this of Jamaica and of some of the other Caribbean islands, but I know this of Haiti, knows for a fact that if they don't behave, there's a good chance they're going to get sent back to Haiti to get reformed. Literally reformed. Okay? They go there, and I am not sure how it works because I have never had to do it with my own daughter, not that I wouldn't, do it. But they do come back different. Somebody said, yeah, they do come back different. When they come back into the courtroom, they're like angels. It's like, is that the same child? Okay, and the judges are so welcoming. The judges love them. They get much more lenient behaviors from the judges, sentences from the judges, than both the white American child and black. Why is that? Well, it's a cultural thing. Just stop me when I break bread. Bye, guys.
Or can we want to just stand up, raise your hand for that type of question? I do have an opportunity for retreat. Remember, we have 15 more minutes, and so we need to leave time for questions.
¿En qué no sabes mi historia? ¿Cuándo te casaste? La primera vez que vine. No conocí mis papás en la casa, ni mi mamá, y aún así me dijo, didn't to say we can talk in English. What? Yeah. I love you though. No. Yeah, he's so cutie. They love him so much.
Problems that we face here is that children not getting medical, especially if they have too much food.
He's a movie producer. He just finished a movie.
I think a lot of it has to do with whether the child's status, right? Unfortunately, if the child is in the child welfare system, and New York has made allowances for that, so it's readily available. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, if they're undocumented, they're not part of the system, they fall through the cracks. And so, yeah, but many children are sent here to live with relatives also, primarily because of the conditions back home that may not allow for secondary education, or other resources. Or they come to live with a father who has a new family here. And what I find is that many of them, as youth, run away or find other ways of leaving the household, which is really unfortunate in the child welfare system in congregate care, because once you're a teenager, most times a foster parent wouldn't take you, right? And so I kept seeing a lot of them come into the congregate care, which is a very unfortunate place to be raised, primarily when you're not familiar with this country, right?
Is that a group home?
Group home, yes, sorry. Yeah, it's a group home. And at the time, many of the girls were dancing to make a living, and they end up, the unfortunate thing also is that they end up in trafficking. They end up in prostitution, boys and girls, so it's very unfortunate, very unfortunate.
Did she just say boys and girls? Did she just say boys and girls?
Our moms and fathers and family members that are giving the opportunity to raise their daughters with friends or maybe with community leaders. So in essence, moms are in a great situation because there's a lot of support, a lot of people. They don't have a legal status that caregiver doesn't take care of that child. So any recommendations on how we can bridge that gap?
So sometimes guardianship, if the caretaker is willing to go in and try to get guardianship, but I don't know how it works in Florida. But not necessarily in terms of bridging the gap. It really is kind of
Sí, lo voy a echar afuera. Mucho invito.
The Census Bureau published, 2009, published, that showed that 79% of the Haitian kids growing up in the United States are growing up in two parent households. We're not talking about grandparents or great-grand or, separated parents. We are talking about the type 2 household, which has two parents in the house with the children. So I'm not sure that it encompasses all of them.
So,
Can you stand up?
oh, sure. Hey, so for the transnational parent, okay, I'm very interested. I work with a lot of and I see this all the time where I see a lot of discussion where one guy comes over, he's a white, so I see a lot of patients, but I'm interested in knowing the Caribbean area. Is this happening really with consent of the wife, or the husband, and then the spouses come over? How much is it consensual? How much does it really work out? I mean, I wanted to know from someone that was studying if this led to a high divorce rate, how often one of those families actually did unify, and then, the immigration aspect, so the immigration aspect of it is quite interesting. I see a lot of times the family member coming to us knowing there's no way to ever get the immigrant. But I don't know if that, I'm interested if that's how much that's the case that you're all people in your studies.
That's part of that. And saying that yes, it's a conscious decision on the part of the parents, whether they were living in a common law relationship and or were married, that whoever has the best opportunity to get here and get freedom legally is the one who comes to you. Yes, when they do get here, and depending on the period of time of separation that you go through the protection, the relationship between the parent and the person who comes here or shortly after they get here, and that happens. So relationship in the Caribbean as well. And, what Christiana mentioned about children being abandoned and not, there's not that always a nothing between parent and child as to why that particular child is chosen to be the parent or to be. The adults in the family know the need, but the children don't. And so they feel that the parent is favor one child over another. And they may feel like they have done something bad there, is a reason why, but they're all creating. The relationship do get affected. And there's another dimension, what is mentioned, is what is called, and they're naturally something right, what is called status equilibrium, i.e. that kind of universal kind of thing that happens for children and parentalized children. I feel like giving themselves taking care of family and helping them in the household, but also for the woman who comes first. She's now empowered by having a job, having a good salary, the rights that protect her, including from domestic violence. Here, as the role reversal from an economic perspective, and also men feeling disempowered because they don't do as much, they're not working in the field that they're working in, and what is well documented is what we call brain drain. And when we talk about brain drain, we talk about that environment, which is here of going abroad, and we have, but also there's a thing called brain drain. In this country, there are many immigrants coming, highly educated, tons of skills and experience, and are operating at low-level positions, way below the education level, way below the because that's where the job is, that's what they take, and they need the money to be able to manage themselves and their household and take care of the family members and they come in. I'm not answering all the questions, but it's on fire.
Yeah, just about that last brain thing. I mean, that's kind of my the reading that I'm trying to ask, one of the things I'm trying to ask. Are they coming here just to escape their relations? That's no. They really have reunification on their mind.
That's right. That is pure separation for many individuals. If you're in people, they think you're undocumented. It takes years before they become documented, that we know very well. And then it takes years to get them sent from the family. If they came here as a permanent, regular, legal permanent, legal resident, it still takes time for them to establish themselves and bring in family, including their spouse or partner here. But the primary push for them is just the relationship part is secondary. The primary push for them are the full factors that I mentioned. The educational opportunity, some of them are going working full time and going to school full time, doing their hospital at the time, or working part time, going to school part time. It's the pull factors, the educational opportunities, the job opportunities, the fact that you're able to provide a better educational opportunity for your children here, which is again, those older children who come with a good, solid educational base, and therefore able to take advantage of all the opportunities K through 12, especially in high school, and then ready to go on to college as well. So our relationship is a causality of the long separation. Similarly to the depression in the children and the abandonment by the children is a causality of the separation from their biological parent and the need here of the caregivers did not. Because the parent did not expect that they would take that long from the children. And that's why, to the best of their ability, the transnational migration partner, the whole parents turn to their country as often as they can. But keep this in mind, if they came and they were undocumented, and they came undocumented, and they did their identity and status protected, they can't travel back home because they wouldn't be able to let back into the country. So they sometimes they physically never see their child, for 3 or 5 years or the long. Is it worth it? And that's one of the things that I've done some research on and Christiana as well, is that we're now looking at what is really worth it. What is worth it for the parents to have left their children behind in the reunification, even with the opportunities? You know, coming, was it really worth it? Was it really worth it? And we would say, without a doubt, it was worth it educationally. The children graduating high school, work college, and graduating college. It was worth it economically, but from a relationship perspective, it does do damage. That relationship is period. It's sacrifices for our DNA. They do have sacrifices because of prejudice.
I would think one of the things that I would like to ask that in terms of what you said is
Sure. One of the things that to keep in mind is, and that's directly in answer to your question, I'm trying to see how to phrase that, because the amazing thing is that these parents are able to reunify and stay together. Because if you're looking at the data in terms of 79% of the Haitian parents who are here being together to raise their kids, we know that so many of these were part of that history, you know, the history where one of them came first, you know, and then brought in the rest of the family. The ability to sustain the family through all that, to me, says a lot about the resilience of these families, because and I think it's also a question of, it's interesting because in terms of the Haitian population, in the 1980s, in the US, the families didn't fare so well. In the 1970s and 60s, what you had was an elite migration of the upper crust of the Haitian elite who came here, and they all came legally. You know, one would come first and the other would come after. But they all came legally and they came rather quickly. And what you saw was a huge amount, generation of divorced parents. And what happened is that they came during the feminist movement in the United States. And in the islands, the women had been very oppressed, their ability to do anything in terms of women's rights was limited. As soon as they got here, within a few years, the divorce rate was so high in that population. You don't see that anymore. It's the opposite now. And you would think that these people are struggling and really struggling economically and just about everything. When they come here, though, they stay together. Do they stay together for the children? That's a big yes. The majority of islanders, whether they get along or not, will stay together for the children.
So it's actually related a lot to everything that you all said. I'm from Africa, but I'm not I haven't directly affected by immigration, but I do have family members who are immigrants to the U.S. So one of the things though that we see a lot back home is that a lot of people who immigrate here are individuals and they do that at a younger age. So then they come back and get married, but it's not they're not already married from here. So is that also something that is an issue with immigrating here, or is it people who are already married?
So I think, I'm sorry, and you can elaborate a little bit. I think you have that population. What I will say to you that the population I study is a part of the diaspora. It isn't every Caribbean person, so that's important. But yes, there are people, immigrants who come here from the Caribbean to study, always has been. Previously, it was primarily for English-speaking Caribbean. They would go to England or some country in Europe. Today they're coming here, they're going to England, and they're also going to Canada. So that population exists, maybe not as large as some of the African countries. And that's something that's an interesting phenomenon as well. So, but you also have people who are married coming here, or if the job market is more feasible for the female or the wife, that you would find that she would be the primary migrant. So it's a mixed.
First, I'd like to thank you for thank you for what you said. I really enjoyed myself. One of the things you touched on was the idea of understanding that not all people from the islands or from the Caribbean are the same. This idea that we are different in the sense of our differences. But I also want to point out the fact that as we analyze and talk about, say, for instance, the academic achievement of African Americans, also understanding that when you analyze them, also understanding that their experiences are different from those in the Caribbean. So we talk about them not necessarily meeting the bar that the Caribbean African students. We have to also take into account the same places like you, like your son, who was recommended for a special day. I also recommended him for a special day. And like you, my mother went to the school. Like I say, when my mother says that you I was not put into special things. And so, so it's a situation where, as we're analyzing the achievements of African American students, we also have to understand that their experiences have been different here. So there's complex issues that affect their achievement inside the classroom. So by naming out the standard of the students, there's more really below the surface.
Yeah, I think. Wait, let me just clear a point. Don't forget, when they're talking about African Americans, every Black person including the islanders. So I wasn't saying that African Americans are not meeting the standard. I'm saying that the educational system in the U.S. basically lacks the fundamental of what is needed to educate Black students overall, including African American, Caribbean, because they fare better when they are in other countries in terms of at the educational level.
That was kind of that. So during the study, during the research, have you noticed similar similarities because of substitutes? So I'm always noticing that my students, especially the minority students, they learn things differently. So when you come in like I'm like, oh, I've had students that experience the same from learning just in the style. So I was learning in the research, have you seen a lot of comparisons?
So my research was primarily focused on the parents, particularly the mothers. What I would say when I asked them, because one of the variables was education, I gathered from them, where are their children now educationally, to see if they can define success, right? And for the most part, with very few, that was a big factor in them succeeding. So many of them were able to see their children realize their dream. Like one of them, with 2 children, one of them just told me she has a PhD. A master's degree in English. So for the English-speaking Caribbean, education is extremely important, and that is a leading factor. But yes, the children learn differently, and we have to learn how to engage them and how to understand them. And part of what happens in this country, and we all have to be aware of it, is that racism permeates all systems and all institutions. And the institutions weren't built for children of color to succeed. And so many of us succeed despite of it, but it's really not easy. So we have to look at how we can, as parents, advocate for our children, but also as parents and professionals, we have to think about what would social justice look like? What would educational justice look like? And when I work with teachers, I teach them action research, so you would think that this should not even be a topic, but it comes up because I'm like, okay, we're in Brooklyn, who are you working with? Who are the students you're working with, So how do you engage those students? And even professionals, teachers who are racially the same as the children they work with have biases against those same children. It's not just a white-black issue, so it's an incredible thing to see happen. So I'm always trying to move the needle in helping them understand the reality of it. I have a lot of teachers who came here as infants from Eastern Europe as refugees, and but they got the message somehow, whether they're from the Caribbean or Europe, that African Americans are bad, bad people, everything connected to it. And so there's a lot of undoing that has to happen in the institutions that we work.
People take one question here, and then we have to wrap it up, and we can definitely continue the conversation.
Like when you talk about mental health and like I'll bring up my Trinidadian mother and same father. And one thing I always do with growing up is through crime, during crime. So like me, that's something I believe myself, and I think that it's taught me, do not cry over situations. Only if you are truly in pain, this is your emotion. You won't have to cry, and everything else is work through. But I live in America where people are often like, you don't touch your kids, but how do you feel about it?
Yeah. So as a child, I was really punished severely, beaten severely. I mean, particularly when I lived with guardians, because my grandmother wasn't able to care for us. So to the point where they would go and get a branch and use that, right? So I would layer up when I knew I had a meeting coming up, provided I had a warning that that was going to happen. So because of that, I didn't want to do it to my child, I have to say. There was nothing about it that I would carry over. But what I would also say, as a human being, and as someone who was part of it, that there were a couple times when I lapsed. I think it was one time. My son thinks it's twice, He would tell you, Mom, you beat me twice. But because it's reactionary, so I had to work really hard to not use that. What I will say that happens to many of us in this country who are trying really hard not to use corporal punishment with our children is that we then do it verbally. We beat our children emotionally and verbally, through verbal and oral words that can be even more punishing and more severely traumatizing to children. So we also have to look for that as well. And that's, as a social worker, where my concern is that emotional abuse that can occur as a result.
I want to quickly insert something that as a child was beaten once. The rest of the time, all my mother had to do was to give me a look. And the look could say any number of things, and it put me in my place, whatever it was that I needed to be doing and walk alive. And so, I too decided. And also from my social work training and background, and it was not about to engage in physical abuse with my child. And so they end up doing a lot of discussion and negotiating and talking about behavior, and making a distinction about not loving the child but not liking the behavior and consequences of the behavior. But the look was.
I think what's interesting, two different things. One of them being when you asked the children that are put in you, remember, being identified, Black children being deliberately, and I'm sorry, I believe it's done deliberately, Black children being put in remedial courses in the United States. And it doesn't matter how intelligent that child is, because my daughter, you told the story of your daughter, so I didn't tell it. My son, so I didn't tell the story of my daughter. But the same thing as you, brilliant child. He gets put into a school in Florida, and they want to put her in a remedial course because her parents, she wrote on the thing that her parents speak a different language. But that didn't go over. So that didn't happen. But we, in terms of corporate my mother used to say that before she gets anywhere near me, to spank me, she doesn't get a chance because I scream so loud that the whole neighborhood thinks she's killing me. So I did get spanked once. And to be honest with you, I guess in the sense islanders are tough because I don't resent my mother for it. I don't even think about it because I have to put something there. But like you, and I think it's because we're part of the American system, we decide, well, we're not going to we're not going to beat our children. I can tell you, my son has 2 events in his life. One of them where I actually remember, the other one which I don't. But I specifically remember that he told me, "You hit me!" And it occurred to me that this time I never been hit. And that Josh did it a few times. But unlike the American families, I don't have any guilt about it, and my son never really, he's the proudest day of my life. I think he said, "Mom, all I can do is say thank you to." He was in college, and I had no
I'm gonna let you. So, one statement, the second generation, first 1.5 generation. So I got here when I was 10 years old, and so went through the whole system. So you lose the position of being kind of raised here, born here, but raised in a Jamaican household, being restricted, things like that. So there's a juxtaposition between being American and being Jamaican, and then not being accepted by anyone. So any thoughts on studying that, because it's a very unique position, kind of like you don't belong anywhere.
Yes.
And then you're told, well, speak Patois, South American, but in America, you sound Jamaican. So anyway, I just thought that that's a unique position that I've never seen studied, and it's interesting to study because it creates, it's just unique. And raising my child.
It's been studied, it has been studied. It has been studied, and I appreciate it. Unfortunately, it's not well populated in terms of literature here, but certainly populated in terms of the Caribbean literature. And I sometimes refer to it as being between 2 worlds. I was college American because I came very young. My cousin told me, please don't speak Patois, my husband as well. And the point is that you are between 2 worlds, and but now I see it as a strength because I can move between and navigate different groups comfortably. But you really do feel marginalized with each, and you have to make a conscious effort to belong, whichever group you're with at the time.
And then my last question is, can we do this again? I think it's a dialogue that has not been done, and I would love to invite some of my Jamaican friends, ones that are new here, ones that have been here, so that we can understand what we're going through, because I know. Thank you. Yes, I think we do need to do this again. And I want to thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and I particularly want to thank Joyce because this was really her idea. And she, I'm just really very, very happy. And thank you to all of you who came, and have a little bit of food on the way out. And feel free to, make some contacts here, and send an email, and keep the discussion up. And yeah, we'll do it again.